Dear my friend, imagine meeting your soulmate and then having to worry about getting executed for it. Welcome to medieval romance, where saying "I love you" could literally be your last words. Picture yourself standing in a bustling 13th century marketplace, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread and questionable hygiene practices. You're watching a young woman nervously glance around before accepting a small bouquet of wildflowers from a man who clearly didn't get the memo that courtship was basically a contact sport back then. The cobblestones beneath your feet are still damp from the morning rain, and somewhere nearby, a merchant is arguing loudly about the price of turnips, because apparently, even love couldn't escape the drama of medieval economics. You probably wouldn't survive this world where holding hands without permission could land you in the stocks, and where your parents had more say in your romantic life than a modern helicopter parent with a GPS tracker. So, before you get comfortable, if you're enjoying this sleepy journey into the past, give this video a like and subscribe to keep these stories coming. Drop a comment with your location and local time. Maybe you're listening in moonlight-soaked Paris or a quiet midnight in Tokyo. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You settle into this medieval world where love wasn't just complicated. It was genuinely life-threatening. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council had just established new rules about marriage that would make modern dating apps seem refreshingly simple. The Church declared that marriage was a sacrament, which sounds romantic until you realize this meant your love life was now under ecclesiastical surveillance. Historians still debate whether these rules made relationships more or less chaotic, but one thing's certain: spontaneous proposals became significantly riskier. Here's something delightfully bizarre. Medieval people believed that looking directly into someone's eyes for too long could literally make you fall in love against your will. So they invented elaborate courtship dances designed to minimize dangerous eye contact. You watch as a young merchant's daughter named Marguerite carefully avoids the gaze of the baker's son across the market square. In this world, even accidental romance could destroy lives, and she knows it. The morning sun filters through the narrow streets, casting long shadows between the timber-framed houses that lean precariously toward each other, like gossiping neighbors. You can hear the distant sound of church bells marking the hours. The same bells that would soon dictate when, how, and with whom people could fall in love. The medieval obsession with controlling love stemmed from something far more practical than moral panic. It was about property, bloodlines, and political alliances that could make or break entire kingdoms. When a nobleman's daughter eloped with her father's stable hand in 1203, it didn't just cause family drama. It potentially shifted land ownership, inheritance rights, and military allegiances that rippled across multiple counties. You witness the weight of these invisible chains as Marguerite's father discusses her future with a cloth merchant from 3 villages away. Their conversation peppered with talk of dowries and trade agreements rather than her happiness. Medieval society had developed an intricate system of arranged marriages that functioned like an early form of strategic corporate mergers, except instead of shareholders, you had entire family lineages to consider. The concept of marrying for love was so foreign that most people didn't even have words for it in their daily vocabulary. Historians still debate whether romantic love, as we understand it, even existed in the common consciousness before the 12th century troubadours started writing about it. Here's a wonderfully absurd detail. Medieval people believed that men and women had completely different types of blood, and mixing them through passionate love could literally cause madness, which explains why arranged marriages were seen as the safer, more rational choice. You follow Marguerite through her daily routine, watching how even the simple act of buying herbs becomes a carefully choreographed dance of propriety. She approaches the herb seller's stall where young Thomas works, but their interaction is observed by at least 6 pairs of eyes: the herb seller's wife, 2 neighboring vendors, a passing priest, and Marguerite's own maid, who hovers nearby like a medieval chaperone with trust issues. Every gesture, every word exchange, every moment of lingering eye contact is noted and mentally cataloged by this informal network of social surveillance. The herb garden behind Thomas's stall tells its own story of medieval romance, or the lack thereof. Rosemary for remembrance, lavender for devotion, and rue for regret grow in neat rows that mirror the rigid social structures governing love. You breathe in the earthy scent of time and realize that even these innocent plants carried romantic meanings that could get someone in trouble if used incorrectly. In 1234, a young woman in Normandy was publicly shamed for giving a man a sprig of rosemary without her father's permission. Apparently, even botanical flirtation was regulated. Medieval communities operated on a system of collective responsibility that made privacy nearly impossible, especially for unmarried young people. Your neighbors weren't just nosy. They were legally and morally obligated to report suspicious romantic behavior to local authorities. The church encouraged this surveillance by teaching that unchaperoned interactions between unmarried people were near occasions of sin that could damn entire communities if left unchecked. Historians still debate whether this system actually prevented illicit relationships or simply made people more creative about hiding them. But court records suggest that secret lovers developed elaborate coded communication systems using everything from flower arrangements to the way they hung laundry. Here's a charmingly ridiculous tidbit. Medieval people believed that sharing food could create spiritual bonds between unmarried people, so even offering someone a piece of bread required careful consideration of the romantic implications. You observe the subtle rebellion happening right under everyone's noses as Marguerite and Thomas develop their own secret language of meaningful glances and carefully timed coincidences. She drops her coin just as he reaches for the same herb bundle, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second that feels both electric and terrifying. The risk they're taking would be incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. This brief moment of physical contact could result in public humiliation, family exile, or worse if discovered and misinterpreted. The medieval legal system had specific punishments for various degrees of romantic transgression that read like a dystopian handbook for controlling human emotion. Holding hands without permission could result in public penance. Unsupervised conversation might warrant a fine. and anything approaching physical intimacy outside marriage could lead to excommunication or banishment. You watch Thomas carefully measure out dried chamomile while his mind clearly races through the potential consequences of his growing feelings. In 1289, a young man in Yorkshire was sentenced to carry a stone around the village square every Sunday for a year, simply because he was caught walking alone with an unmarried woman after dark. The economic implications of unauthorized love were staggering in a world where marriage contracts represented major financial transactions between families. When people married for love rather than arrangement, they disrupted carefully planned networks of mutual support, trade agreements, and inheritance structures that had taken generations to establish. A runaway romance could destabilize entire communities by breaking promised alliances and leaving families without the expected economic partnerships that marriage provided. Historians still debate whether the medieval emphasis on arranged marriage was more about controlling women or protecting economic systems, but the result was the same. Love became a luxury that most people simply couldn't afford. Here's a wonderfully absurd aspect of medieval romance. People believed that sudden emotional attachment could cause physical symptoms similar to serious illness. So falling in love was literally considered a medical condition that required treatment by both doctors and priests. You drift through the winding alleys behind the marketplace where secret messages travel through a network more sophisticated than any medieval postal system. The laundry lines. Marguerite has learned that hanging her father's brown tunic next to her blue dress means she'll be at the well at sunset, while Thomas responds by arranging his herb bundles in specific patterns that only she understands. This elaborate communication system would make modern teenagers with their coded text messages seem refreshingly straightforward by comparison. The well becomes their unofficial meeting place, chosen not for romance, but for plausible deniability. Everyone needs water after all. You watch as they perfect the art of meaningful conversation disguised as mundane small talk about weather and water quality. Their discussions about whether the well water tastes different this week carry undertones of longing that would make a modern soap opera seem subtle. The irony is delicious. In an age where direct communication between unmarried people was forbidden, they've become masters of subtext that would challenge a literature professor. Medieval water sources served as crucial social gathering points where information, gossip, and yes, romantic intrigue flowed as freely as the water itself. The village well represented one of the few places where young people of different social classes might interact without immediate suspicion, though even this required careful timing and social choreography. In 1267, the Bishop of Lincoln issued specific guidelines about proper behavior at communal wells, suggesting that even these necessary interactions had become sources of moral concern. You notice how Marguerite times her arrival for when the well area is busy enough to provide cover, but not so crowded as to make private conversation impossible. A delicate balance that requires both patience and strategic thinking. Historians still debate whether these public meeting places actually prevented improper relationships or simply made them more creative and therefore more dangerous. Here's a delightfully odd detail. Medieval people believed that sharing water from the same container created a spiritual bond, so couples would sometimes deliberately drink from each other's water vessels as a form of unofficial betrothal ceremony. You follow the seasonal rhythms that dictate when and how forbidden romance can safely unfold in this medieval world. Spring brings longer days and more excuses to be outdoors, but it also brings increased scrutiny as families begin planning summer weddings and evaluating potential matches for their children. Marguerite finds herself under more watchful eyes as her father receives inquiries from 3 different families about her availability, each conversation a reminder that her romantic fate hangs in other people's hands. The herb garden behind Thomas's stall becomes a living calendar of their secret relationship as different plants bloom and fade throughout the growing season. You watch him tend the rosemary with extra care, knowing that Marguerite passes by each morning and understands that healthy rosemary means he's thinking of her. When the lavender reaches full bloom in late summer, it signals the most dangerous time of year for secret lovers. Harvest season, when communities work closely together and privacy becomes nearly impossible to maintain. Medieval agricultural cycles created natural periods of opportunity and restriction for unauthorized romance that govern the rhythm of countless secret relationships. During planting and harvest seasons, young people worked in close proximity under intense community supervision, making romantic encounters both more tempting and more risky. The church recognized these seasonal patterns and adjusted its moral vigilance accordingly, with priests delivering specific sermons about controlling lustful thoughts during times when temptation was considered highest. In 1245, church records from Canterbury show that more young people were brought before ecclesiastical courts for romantic transgressions during harvest months than at any other time of year. You observe how Thomas and Marguerite adapt their secret communication system to match the seasonal demands of agricultural life, developing new coded signals that work even when they're surrounded by other workers in the fields. Historians still debate whether seasonal work patterns made unauthorized relationships more or less common, but court records suggest that forbidden love followed predictable annual cycles. Here's a charmingly bizarre aspect of medieval romance. People believed that certain times of year were more favorable for falling in love based on the position of celestial bodies. So even spontaneous attraction was thought to be governed by cosmic forces beyond human control. You witness the delicate art of medieval gift-giving between secret lovers, where a simple wildflower becomes a loaded political statement and a shared apple could spark village-wide gossip. Marguerite carefully selects a sprig of mint from her family's kitchen garden, knowing that Thomas will understand its meaning. Fresh beginnings, perhaps, or simply the hope that their secret won't grow stale under the weight of social pressure. She wraps it in a piece of rough cloth and leaves it near the herb stall when no one is watching, a gesture so subtle it would barely register as romantic by modern standards, yet carries enormous risk in her world. The exchange of even the most innocent gifts between unmarried people required careful consideration of their symbolic meaning, market value, and potential misinterpretation by community observers. A flower that cost nothing could be dismissed as friendly gesture, but anything with actual monetary value. A ribbon, a small piece of jewelry, even a particularly good apple, suggested serious romantic intention that could trigger immediate family intervention. You watch Thomas discover the mint sprig and quickly pocket it before anyone notices, his relief palpable as he realizes the gift is both meaningful and deniable. Medieval gift exchanges operated within complex social codes that regulated not just what could be given, but when, how, and in whose presence such exchanges could occur. The Church taught that accepting gifts from potential suitors without parental permission was a form of theft, stealing the family's right to control their daughter's romantic prospects. In 1278, a young woman in Devon was made to do public penance for accepting a wooden comb from an unapproved suitor, the punishment serving as both personal humiliation and community warning about the consequences of unauthorized gift acceptance. You notice how carefully Marguerite considers every small kindness Thomas shows her, weighing its romantic implications against its potential for causing trouble. The mental calculations required for secret romance in this era would exhaust modern lovers who consider relationship status updates complicated. Historians still debate whether these restrictions made gifts more or less meaningful. But surviving love letters suggest that even the smallest tokens carried enormous emotional weight precisely because they were so dangerous to exchange. Here's a wonderfully absurd detail. Medieval people believed that accepting certain types of gifts could legally constitute a binding engagement contract. So young women were taught to refuse even the most innocent offerings to avoid accidental betrothal. You observe the psychological toll that living a double life takes on both Marguerite and Thomas as summer stretches toward autumn, and the pressure to make approved marriage arrangements intensifies. Marguerite's father has begun receiving more serious inquiries about her availability, including one from a successful wool merchant who could significantly improve the family's economic standing. She sits by her window at night, carefully crafting responses to letters she'll never send, and rehearsing conversations she'll never have, trapped between duty and desire in a way that would resonate across centuries of star-crossed lovers. The weight of keeping romantic secrets in a society that viewed privacy with suspicion creates a constant state of low-level anxiety that modern people would find unbearable. Every conversation must be carefully monitored for accidental revelations, every facial expression controlled to avoid betraying hidden emotions, and every social interaction evaluated for its potential to expose the secret relationship. You watch Thomas stumble through small talk with Marguerite's father at the market, his nervousness hopefully attributed to respect for his elder rather than guilt over secret romantic feelings for the man's daughter. Medieval communities developed sophisticated methods for detecting unauthorized romantic relationships that combined formal interrogation techniques with informal social pressure. Church confessionals served as intelligence-gathering operations where priests could extract information about suspicious behavior, while community festivals and gatherings provided opportunities for observing who paid inappropriate attention to whom. In 1282, the town records of Coventry describe a system of rotating chaperones assigned to monitor young unmarried people during social events, creating an early form of organized romantic surveillance. You witness the exhausting mental gymnastics required to maintain the appearance of proper behavior while nurturing genuine feelings that grow stronger despite the constant threat of discovery. The psychological stress of forbidden love in this era probably shortened lifespans more effectively than poor sanitation or inadequate medical care. Historians still debate whether these restrictions actually prevented unauthorized marriages or simply made people more determined to pursue them, but personal correspondence from the period suggests that secret lovers developed remarkable resilience and creativity under pressure. Here's a delightfully ironic detail. Medieval advice literature warned parents that being too restrictive with their children's romantic choices could drive them toward exactly the kind of passionate, irrational attachments that arranged marriages were designed to prevent. You enter the most treacherous phase of Marguerite and Thomas's secret relationship as autumn arrives and marriage negotiations become unavoidably serious. The wool merchant has made a formal offer for Marguerite's hand, complete with detailed financial arrangements that would secure her family's prosperity for generations. You watch her father's face light up as he calculates the dowry requirements and trade opportunities, completely oblivious to his daughter's internal anguish as her future gets decided over ale and handshake agreements that feel more like a livestock transaction than a romantic arrangement. The pressure of impending arranged marriage creates a deadline that transforms secret romance from a pleasant diversion into a desperate race against time. Marguerite begins experiencing what medieval physicians would have diagnosed as lovesickness, actual physical symptoms including loss of appetite, sleeplessness, and a persistent melancholy that her family attributes to maidenly nervousness about her upcoming betrothal. You observe her growing thin and pale, a living demonstration of how emotional stress manifested in measurable ways in an era that understood the connection between mind and body better than they're often credited with. Medieval medical texts described lovesickness as a genuine ailment that required treatment by both physicians and spiritual advisors. Recognizing that unauthorized romantic attachment could cause real physical deterioration. The condition was considered especially dangerous for unmarried women, whose supposed emotional volatility made them vulnerable to what doctors called excessive passion syndrome. In 1294, a court physician in France prescribed a combination of bloodletting, herbal treatments, and enforced separation from the beloved as standard treatment for acute lovesickness, essentially making medical intervention another tool for controlling unauthorized romance. You witness Marguerite's attempts to hide her symptoms, while her mother begins attributing her daughter's listlessness to normal pre-marriage anxiety, a misdiagnosis that's both heartbreaking and convenient for maintaining the family's wedding plans. Historians still debate whether medieval people genuinely believed lovesickness was primarily a female ailment, or whether this was simply another way to pathologize women's romantic autonomy. Here's a fascinatingly twisted detail. Medieval people believed that lovesickness could be cured by consummating the forbidden relationship, but since that solution was worse than the disease in terms of social consequences, Most treatments focused on eliminating the emotional attachment rather than satisfying it. You witness the final desperate attempts at communication as both Marguerite and Thomas realize their time is running out. The herb garden that once seemed like a safe haven for their coded messages now feels exposed and dangerous as Marguerite's upcoming betrothal draws community attention to her every movement. She can no longer linger at the market stalls or time her water-gathering trips to coincide with his work schedule without raising suspicions that could destroy both their families' reputations and their own futures. Thomas makes the dangerous decision to write an actual letter, not the subtle flower arrangements or meaningful glances that have sustained their relationship, but real words on precious parchment that could serve as evidence if discovered. You watch him struggle with a quill pen by candlelight, trying to express months of suppressed feelings in language that won't damn them both if the letter falls into wrong hands. The irony is palpable. In an age when most people can't read, he's risking everything on written words that exist specifically to circumvent the verbal surveillance that governs their daily lives. Medieval literacy rates meant that love letters were simultaneously more precious and more dangerous than in any other historical period. Precious because so few people could create them. Dangerous because they provided undeniable physical evidence of unauthorized romantic relationships. The ability to read and write was concentrated among the clergy and nobility, making romantic correspondence a luxury that most secret lovers couldn't afford, and a liability that even educated lovers approached with extreme caution. In 1301, church records from Winchester describe a case where a young woman's ability to read a love letter was used as evidence against her character, suggesting that female literacy itself was viewed with suspicion when applied to romantic matters. You feel the weight of Thomas's decision as he considers whether to sign his name, use a false signature, or leave the letter anonymous. Each choice carrying different risks and different possibilities for Marguerite to respond. The mental chess game required for medieval romantic communication would challenge modern lovers who think relationship drama is complicated. Historians still debate whether the scarcity of literacy made love letters more or less common. But surviving examples suggest that illiterate lovers often employed sympathetic scribes, creating a small underground economy of romantic correspondence services. Here's a charmingly absurd aspect of medieval love letters. People believed that certain inks and papers could carry curses or blessings. So even the physical materials used for romantic correspondence required careful consideration of their spiritual implications. You follow the perilous journey of Thomas's letter as it makes its way through a network of sympathetic intermediaries who understand the stakes involved in delivering unauthorized romantic correspondence. The baker's apprentice, who has his own reasons for supporting secret love, agrees to hide the letter in a loaf of bread destined for Marguerite's family kitchen. This method of concealment would seem like something from a spy novel, except the consequences of discovery are arguably more severe than most modern espionage. Social death, family exile, and eternal damnation represent a trifecta of punishments that make prison sentences seem gentle by comparison. Marguerite discovers the letter while helping her mother prepare the evening meal, her heart racing as she recognizes Thomas's careful handwriting on the small piece of parchment wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from the bread's moisture. The letter itself is a masterpiece of medieval romantic caution, passionate enough to convey genuine feeling, vague enough to maintain plausible deniability, and brief enough to be quickly destroyed if necessary. You watch her read words that finally give voice to months of meaningful glances and carefully orchestrated coincidences, transforming their silent relationship into something that feels dangerously real. Medieval romantic correspondence required a delicate balance between expressing genuine emotion and maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid legal consequences if discovered. Love letters from this period often read like diplomatic documents, filled with coded language and careful phrasing that could be interpreted as platonic friendship if subjected to official scrutiny. The Church taught that romantic correspondence between unmarried people was inherently sinful because it encouraged lustful thoughts and undermined parental authority over marriage arrangements. In 1315, a collection of intercepted love letters was used as evidence in an ecclesiastical court case that resulted in the excommunication of 3 young couples, establishing legal precedent that made romantic correspondence a form of heretical activity. You sense Marguerite's terror and excitement as she holds physical proof that her feelings are reciprocated, knowing that this piece of parchment could either save her from an unwanted marriage or destroy her family's social standing forever. The emotional intensity of forbidden correspondence in this era probably exceeded anything modern lovers experience, simply because the stakes were so much higher. Historians still debate whether love letters made unauthorized relationships more or less likely to succeed. But their survival in family archives suggests that some couples managed to use them effectively despite the enormous risks involved. Here's a delightfully paranoid detail. Medieval people believed that love letters could be cursed by jealous rivals or disapproving family members, so recipients often performed protective prayers before reading romantic correspondence to guard against spiritual attack. You witness the heartbreaking moment when Marguerite realizes that Thomas's letter, beautiful as it is, changes nothing about her situation and may have actually made everything worse. The wool merchant's formal proposal has been accepted. The betrothal ceremony is scheduled for the following month, and her father has already begun making arrangements that treat her future as a settled matter, requiring no further input from her. The letter serves as both a declaration of love and a reminder of its ultimate futility in a world where individual desire means nothing compared to family obligation and economic necessity. The weight of impossible choice settles over both lovers like a suffocating blanket as they confront the reality that their relationship has no viable future within the social structure they inhabit. Marguerite could refuse the arranged marriage, but doing so would bring shame and financial ruin to her entire family, potentially condemning her parents to poverty in their old age and her younger siblings to reduced marriage prospects. Thomas could formally ask for her hand, but his modest status as a tradesman's son makes him completely unsuitable as a match for a merchant's daughter whose family has upward social mobility within reach. Medieval social mobility was so limited that romantic relationships across class boundaries represented not just personal rebellion, but fundamental challenges to the established order that kept communities stable and hierarchies intact. The rigid social stratification that modern people find oppressive actually served important functions in an era when economic security depended on maintaining predictable networks of mutual obligation and support. When young people married outside their social class for love, they often discovered that romantic feelings couldn't compensate for the practical challenges of navigating a world that punished social boundary crossing with systematic exclusion and economic hardship. In 1322, records from a manor court in Essex show that a carpenter's son who married above his station was effectively blacklisted from guild membership, illustrating how romantic choices could have professional consequences that lasted lifetimes. You feel the crushing weight of social inevitability as both Marguerite and Thomas begin to understand that their love, however genuine, is simply incompatible with the world they live in. The tragedy of medieval romance wasn't just that it was forbidden. It was that it was structurally impossible within the economic and social systems that govern daily life. Historians still debate whether class-crossing marriages were more common than surviving records suggest, but legal documents indicate that such relationships faced institutional obstacles designed to make them fail even when they were initially tolerated. Here's a sadly ironic detail. Medieval people believed that true love could overcome any obstacle, but their social system was specifically designed to prove that belief wrong through systematic punishment of unauthorized romantic choices. You observe the slow disintegration of hope as winter approaches and Marguerite's betrothal ceremony draws near. The marketplace that once felt alive with possibility now seems like a stage set for her final performance as an unmarried woman with dreams of choosing her own path. Thomas continues his daily work at the herb stall, but you notice how his movements have become mechanical, going through the motions of normal life while processing the reality that everything meaningful in his world is about to disappear behind the walls of social convention. The betrothal ceremony itself represents one of medieval society's most effective tools for transforming individual tragedy into community celebration, forcing everyone to participate in a ritual that validates the supremacy of practical arrangement over personal desire. You watch Marguerite's mother excitedly plan festivities that feel more like a funeral to her daughter, discussing menu details and guest lists with the same enthusiasm that Marguerite once reserved for stolen moments with Thomas. The cognitive dissonance required to participate in your own romantic execution would challenge the strongest medieval mind. Medieval betrothal ceremonies served multiple social functions beyond simply announcing marriage intentions. They created public witnesses to family alliances, demonstrated economic status through elaborate displays of wealth, and provided communities with entertainment that reinforced social hierarchies through ritualized celebration of approved matches. The Church blessed these ceremonies specifically because they represented victory of rational arrangement over dangerous passion, treating each successful betrothal as evidence that divine order could triumph over human weakness. In 1328, a bishop's sermon delivered at a noble betrothal ceremony explicitly praised the families for choosing godly prudence over worldly affection, establishing the theological framework that made arranged marriage a religious duty rather than mere social custom. You sense Marguerite's growing desperation as she realizes that participating in her own betrothal ceremony will make her complicit in destroying the only genuine happiness she's ever known, transforming her from victim into willing participant in her own romantic demise. The psychological pressure of maintaining proper appearance during public celebration of unwanted marriage would break most modern people within hours. Historians still debate whether betrothed women genuinely accepted their arranged marriages or simply became expert at hiding their true feelings. But surviving personal writings suggest that many developed sophisticated coping mechanisms that resembled what modern psychologists would recognize as dissociation. Here's a heartbreakingly efficient detail. Medieval betrothal ceremonies included specific rituals designed to symbolically transfer the woman's emotional loyalty from her birth family to her future husband's family, literally choreographing the death of her previous identity and the birth of her new role as someone else's property. You witness Thomas making the desperate decision that countless forbidden lovers throughout history have faced, whether to fight against impossible odds or accept defeat gracefully. The night before Marguerite's betrothal ceremony, he stands outside her family's house in the cold darkness, clutching a final letter that represents either their last hope or their final goodbye. The moonlight filtering through bare winter branches creates shadows that seem to mirror the fractured remains of their relationship. Beautiful, but ultimately insubstantial when confronted with the solid reality of social expectations. His final letter abandons all pretense of caution and diplomatic language, instead offering Marguerite what medieval society would consider the ultimate romantic heresy, an invitation to choose love over duty by running away together to start a new life in a distant town where their past wouldn't matter. You feel the weight of this proposition, understanding that he's essentially asking her to commit social suicide for the chance at happiness that may or may not survive the harsh realities of life as social outcasts. The romantic gesture that modern audiences would applaud represents genuine catastrophe in medieval terms. Medieval society had limited tolerance for people who abandoned their social obligations for personal fulfillment, creating a system where romantic rebellion almost inevitably led to poverty, isolation, and early death for couples who chose love over arrangement. The few documented cases of successful romantic elopement typically involved families wealthy enough to weather social disapproval, or couples willing to immigrate to distant regions where they could reinvent their identities completely. The Church taught that abandoning family duty for romantic attachment was a form of selfishness that violated the divine order requiring individual sacrifice for community stability. In 1335, church records from Canterbury describe the excommunication of a young couple who eloped against their family's wishes, noting that their punishment served as necessary instruction for other young people who might consider similar romantic rebellion. You observe Marguerite reading Thomas's proposal by candlelight, her face cycling through emotions that range from joy at his devotion to terror at the consequences of accepting his offer. The decision she faces would challenge anyone's moral framework. Choose personal happiness at the cost of family welfare, or sacrifice individual fulfillment to maintain social stability and economic security for everyone she loves. Historians still debate whether medieval romantic elopements were more or less common than surviving records suggest. But legal documents indicate that most couples who attempted such escapes were eventually tracked down and returned to face consequences that served as public warnings about the futility of romantic rebellion. Here's a tragically practical detail. Medieval people who eloped for love often discovered that their romantic idealism hadn't prepared them for the basic survival skills required for life outside established social networks, leading to malnutrition, homelessness, and early death rates that made arranged marriage seem merciful by comparison. You follow Marguerite through the longest night of her life as she weighs Thomas's proposal against every practical consideration that her medieval upbringing has taught her to value above personal desire. The winter wind rattling her shutters seems to echo the internal storm of conflicting loyalties that threatens to tear her apart. Duty to family versus loyalty to love, economic security versus romantic fulfillment, social respectability versus authentic happiness. You watch her pace her small chamber, holding Thomas's letter like a talisman that could either save or damn her depending on the choice she makes before dawn. The mathematics of medieval romantic rebellion are brutally clear when calculated honestly. Choosing love means condemning not just herself and Thomas to probable poverty and social exile, but also potentially destroying her family's carefully planned economic future and her younger siblings' marriage prospects. Her father's investment in the Wool Merchant Alliance represents years of strategic relationship building that could elevate the entire family's social status for generations. You observe her mentally cataloging the consequences that would ripple outward from her personal decision, understanding that individual romantic choice in this era carries collective responsibility that modern lovers rarely have to consider. Medieval family economics operated on principles of mutual dependence that made individual romantic rebellion a form of economic warfare against everyone who relied on the family's stability and reputation for their own survival. The dowry her father would lose, the trade relationships that would be damaged, and the social connections that would be severed by a romantic scandal could impoverish her entire extended family network in ways that would take decades to repair. The Church reinforced these practical considerations by teaching that romantic selfishness was spiritually equivalent to theft, stealing the family's investment in her future and the community's right to expect predictable social behavior. In 1342, a manor court judgment against a young woman who refused an approved marriage specifically calculated the financial damages her romantic rebellion had caused her family, establishing legal precedent that made individual romantic choice a form of property crime. You feel Marguerite's anguish as she realizes that accepting Thomas's proposal would transform her from beloved daughter into family destroyer, making her happiness literally dependent on other people's suffering. the emotional weight of collective responsibility for romantic decisions would crush most modern people who consider relationship choices purely personal matters. Historians still debate whether medieval emphasis on family welfare over individual desire was primarily about social control or genuine economic necessity, but surviving household account books suggest that romantic scandals could indeed cause measurable financial damage that lasted for years. Here's a devastatingly logical detail. Medieval people calculated the true cost of romantic rebellion in terms of lost opportunities, damaged relationships, and reduced life prospects that extended far beyond the immediate couple, making unauthorized love a luxury that most families literally couldn't afford, even if they wanted to support it. You witness the dawn of Marguerite's betrothal day as she makes the decision that will define the rest of her life and determine whether love or duty ultimately triumphs in her personal battle against medieval social expectations. The gray winter morning seems to match her emotional state as she carefully burns Thomas's letter in her chamber fireplace, watching their last hope for happiness curl into ash that she'll sweep away before her family awakens to prepare for the ceremony. The symbolic destruction of their correspondence feels like a funeral for possibilities that were never quite real in the first place. Her decision to honor the arranged marriage represents not surrender, but a form of medieval heroism that prioritizes community welfare over individual fulfillment, a choice that her society will celebrate even as it quietly destroys her spirit. You observe her methodically preparing for the betrothal ceremony with the same careful attention to detail she once devoted to secret meetings with Thomas, transforming herself into the dutiful daughter her family needs her to be, while burying the authentic person who dared to dream of choosing her own path. The performance required for public acceptance of unwanted marriage would challenge the acting abilities of professional entertainers. Medieval women who chose duty over desire often developed remarkable psychological resilience that allowed them to find meaning and even satisfaction within the constraints of arranged marriage, though this adaptation came at the cost of acknowledging that their deepest emotional needs would remain permanently unfulfilled. The Church taught that such sacrifice was spiritually beneficial because it demonstrated triumph over selfish desire and commitment to divine order that placed community stability above individual happiness. Historical records suggest that many arranged marriages did eventually develop into affectionate partnerships, though whether this represented genuine emotional attachment or sophisticated coping mechanisms remains unclear to modern scholars. In 1349, a collection of letters between a woman and her arranged husband reveals a relationship that evolved from dutiful cooperation to apparent mutual respect. Though the correspondence carefully avoids any language that might suggest romantic passion, you sense Marguerite's internal transformation as she practices the facial expressions and voice modulations that will convince her community she's genuinely happy about her betrothal, perfecting a performance that must be maintained for the rest of her life to avoid bringing shame to her family. The psychological compartmentalization required for successful adaptation to unwanted marriage would fascinate modern therapists who work with trauma survivors. Historians still debate whether medieval women who accepted arranged marriages were victims of oppression or architects of practical survival strategies, but personal writings suggest that many developed complex emotional lives that existed alongside but separate from their official social roles. Here's a quietly heartbreaking detail. Medieval women often used domestic activities like weaving, embroidery, and cooking as meditative practices that allowed them to process suppressed emotions and maintain psychological stability while fulfilling their assigned social functions. You observe the betrothal ceremony unfolding with all the pageantry and celebration that medieval communities used to transform individual sacrifice into collective triumph. Marguerite stands beside the wool merchant, her face composed in an expression of modest happiness that she's practiced until it feels almost natural, while Thomas watches from the crowd of well-wishers with the kind of smile that would fool everyone except someone who knew what to look for. The irony is exquisite. A community celebration of love that specifically excludes the only genuine romantic attachment anyone present has experienced. The ritual exchange of gifts, promises, and blessings creates a public performance that validates the social system while quietly burying the emotional cost required to maintain it. You watch Marguerite accept a silver brooch from her betrothed, knowing that she's simultaneously receiving a symbol of her new status and a tangible reminder that her authentic feelings have no place in her official life. The weight of the brooch against her chest will serve as a permanent physical reminder of the choice she made to preserve her family's welfare at the expense of her own happiness. Medieval betrothal ceremonies included specific rituals designed to publicly demonstrate that the arrangement had community approval and divine blessing, creating social pressure that made it nearly impossible for participants to withdraw, even if they developed second thoughts. The exchange of rings, the sharing of blessed wine, and the formal declaration of intent created legal and spiritual bonds that were considered as binding as actual marriage vows. Church records from 1356 describe a case where a woman who attempted to break her betrothal after the ceremony was charged with breach of contract and forced to compensate her former fiancé's family for wedding expenses and damaged reputation. You witness the psychological complexity required for Marguerite to participate authentically in a ceremony that celebrates everything she's had to give up, transforming genuine grief into performed gratitude in a way that would challenge the emotional regulation skills of modern actors. The community's genuine joy at her betrothal makes her isolation even more complete, surrounded by people celebrating her future, while she privately mourns the death of her dreams. Historians still debate whether betrothal ceremonies were primarily about legal contract formation or social control, but their elaborate nature suggests they served important psychological functions in helping participants accept arrangements they might otherwise resist. Here's a fascinatingly cruel detail. Medieval betrothal ceremonies often included specific moments where the bride-to-be was required to publicly declare her happiness with the arrangement, essentially forcing her to lie convincingly about her emotional state as a condition of social acceptance. You follow Thomas through the aftermath of the betrothal ceremony as he confronts the reality that his secret relationship has officially ended, and he must somehow reconstruct a meaningful life from the wreckage of his romantic hopes. The herb garden that once felt like sacred ground now seems like a monument to naivety. Its carefully tended plants, a reminder of how much time and emotional energy he invested in something that was always destined to fail. You watch him mechanically water the rosemary that no longer carries coded messages, understanding that even the most mundane activities have been permanently altered by the weight of loss. The social expectation that he'll simply move on to an appropriate romantic attachment demonstrates medieval society's assumption that genuine emotional connections can be transferred from person to person like business partnerships, ignoring the reality that authentic love doesn't follow the same rules as arranged convenience. His family begins discussing potential marriages with daughters of other tradesmen, conversations that feel surreal in their assumption that his heart can be reassigned to someone more suitable now that his inappropriate attachment has been resolved. You sense his growing understanding that the world he inhabits has no vocabulary for the kind of grief he's experiencing. Medieval society's approach to managing disappointed romantic attachment focused on immediate redirection toward approved alternatives rather than allowing time for emotional processing, operating on the assumption that prolonged mourning for unauthorized love was both spiritually dangerous and socially disruptive. Young men who showed signs of persistent attachment to inappropriate romantic partners were often sent away for apprenticeships or military service that would physically separate them from temptation while providing distraction through demanding work. The Church taught that romantic obsession with unavailable partners was a form of spiritual sickness that could be cured through prayer, hard labor, and deliberate cultivation of appropriate affections directed towards suitable marriage prospects. In 1363, a guildmaster's records describe sending a lovesick apprentice to work in a distant city specifically to help him forget his foolish attachments and develop proper romantic interests, illustrating how communities actively intervened to redirect unauthorized emotional investments. You observe Thomas struggling with internal conflict between his family's practical advice to find a suitable wife and his emotional inability to imagine loving anyone else, a dilemma that his society considers temporary, but that feels permanent from his perspective. The assumption that romantic feelings can be controlled through willpower and social pressure would seem absurd to modern people who understand the psychological complexity of emotional attachment. Historians still debate whether medieval people actually believed love could be easily redirected or whether they simply had no alternative framework for managing romantic disappointment in a socially acceptable way. Here's an oddly touching detail. Medieval people often kept small mementos of lost love hidden in their daily belongings, creating private shrines to relationships that officially never existed while maintaining the public appearance of moving on successfully. You witness the gradual establishment of new routines as both Marguerite and Thomas learn to navigate their transformed world where their former connection exists only in carefully guarded memories and the occasional meaningful glance across the marketplace. Marguerite's preparation for married life involves learning the specific domestic skills that will make her valuable to her new household, while Thomas throws himself into expanding his knowledge of herb cultivation with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts. Their parallel attempts to build meaningful futures from the ruins of their shared dreams create a kind of synchronized grief that neither can acknowledge. The marketplace that once felt electric with possibility becomes neutral territory, where they must practice the art of treating each other as casual acquaintances rather than former lovers, a performance that requires constant vigilance and emotional discipline. You observe the careful choreography they develop to avoid situations that might reawaken dangerous feelings. Marguerite timing her visits to avoid Thomas's work schedule. Thomas finding excuses to leave his stall when her family approaches. The energy required to maintain this emotional distance while continuing to live in the same small community would exhaust anyone. But medieval society provides no alternative framework for managing such situations. Medieval communities expected former romantic attachments to dissolve cleanly once appropriate marriages were arranged, operating on the assumption that social pressure and practical concerns would naturally override any lingering emotional connections that threatened approved relationships. The lack of privacy in medieval life meant that continued interaction between former lovers was inevitable, but also dangerous, requiring them to develop sophisticated emotional regulation skills that allowed them to maintain appropriate behavior while processing unresolved feelings. Church teachings emphasized that persistent romantic attachment to unavailable partners was a form of spiritual weakness that could be overcome through prayer and deliberate cultivation of appropriate affections. Though pastoral records suggest that priests often struggled with parishioners who couldn't successfully redirect their emotions. In 1371, a confessor's manual includes specific guidance for helping young people purge themselves of inappropriate romantic memories through a combination of penance, distraction, and forced association with suitable marriage prospects, revealing the extent to which unauthorized love was considered a problem requiring active intervention. You feel the exhausting mental effort required for both Marguerite and Thomas to maintain the fiction that their former relationship was insignificant while privately dealing with grief that their society refuses to acknowledge as legitimate. The psychological compartmentalization required for this performance would challenge modern people who have access to counseling and social support for relationship loss. Historians still debate whether medieval people were actually more emotionally resilient or simply better at hiding psychological distress. But personal writings suggest that many carried unresolved romantic grief throughout their entire lives. Here's a poignantly human detail. Medieval people often developed elaborate superstitions about avoiding specific locations or activities associated with lost love, creating personal geography of emotional avoidance that helped them function in communities where escape from painful memories was impossible. You observe the final chapter of this medieval love story as both Marguerite and Thomas settle into the lives that society has chosen for them, finding ways to create meaning and even moments of genuine happiness within the constraints that once seemed unbearable. Marguerite discovers unexpected satisfaction in mastering the complex household management required for her new status, while Thomas develops a reputation for superior herb cultivation that brings him respect and economic security he never expected. Their adaptation to circumstances beyond their control demonstrates the remarkable human capacity for resilience that has sustained people through countless generations of impossible choices. The wool merchant proves to be a kinder husband than Marguerite dared hope, treating her with genuine respect and even consulting her opinions on household matters in ways that suggest he values her intelligence beyond her economic utility. Thomas eventually accepts his family's arrangement with a baker's daughter, whose quiet competence and gentle humor create the foundation for a partnership that, while different from passionate romance, offers its own forms of companionship and mutual support. You witness both of them learning to appreciate the gifts their arranged relationships provide, while privately maintaining the treasure of memories from their brief season of authentic love. Medieval society's success in managing unauthorized romantic attachments depended partly on its ability to provide alternative sources of meaning and satisfaction that helped people find purpose beyond their initial romantic preferences. Arranged marriages often developed into genuine partnerships over time, as couples learned to appreciate qualities in each other that weren't immediately apparent during courtship, but proved valuable for long-term compatibility. The Church taught that married love was actually superior to romantic passion because it was based on commitment and mutual service rather than temporary emotional attraction, though this theological position conveniently supported social arrangements that prioritized stability over individual fulfillment. In 1378, a collection of household accounts shows a formerly reluctant bride taking pride in her management of family finances and trade relationships, suggesting that many medieval women found empowerment through competent fulfillment of their assigned roles, even when those roles weren't their original choice. You sense both Marguerite and Thomas gradually discovering that their lives, while different from their youthful dreams, contain genuine pleasures and satisfactions that make continued existence meaningful rather than merely endurable. The human capacity to adapt and find happiness within limitation would become a recurring theme throughout history as people in every era learned to build fulfilling lives from whatever circumstances they inherited or chose. Historians still debate whether medieval people were happier with arranged marriages than modern people are with romantic choice, but personal writings suggest that satisfaction often depended more on individual attitude and mutual respect than on the method by which couples were initially brought together. As our story draws to a close, you find yourself back in that same marketplace where we began, watching new generations of young people navigate the eternal dance between desire and duty that has shaped human relationships across centuries. The cobblestones still hold the echoes of countless footsteps. The market stalls still overflow with herbs that carry secret meanings. And somewhere in the shadows between what is and what might have been, love continues to find ways to flourish despite every attempt to control or contain it. The medieval world may seem impossibly distant from our modern concerns, but the human heart that beats within it remains remarkably familiar, still hoping, still yearning, still finding ways to create beauty and meaning, even in the most constrained circumstances. Let these ancient voices remind you that love, in all its forms, has always been both dangerous and essential, both impossible and inevitable, as constant as the turning of seasons, and as fragile as morning frost on windowsills. Sleep now, and dream of times when even the smallest gesture of affection required the courage of heroes, and when ordinary people found extraordinary ways to honor both duty and desire in a world that demanded they choose between them.